of the trees regarding our gender identity and sexuality. When there's no place like home, empty air, an empty establishment. Friends with Dorothy, fighting for your civil rights. Out on the cruel streets tonight.
Stronger than ever because because if anything, the last 3 years has only shown why we need Pride more than ever with the upscaling of attacks on the trans and intersex community. In 2020, the start of lockdowns left so many young trans and non-binary people in unsafe conditions, and especially, as they say, cut them off from the physical and mental health care that they need even further. And in 2020, the resurgence of the Black Lives Matter movement exposed the pervasion of violence faced by black trans people in the US every day. And in 2021, we saw internationally that it was the deadliest year for non-binary people on record. And now, just months into 2022, we have seen the exposing of the deep transphobia in the Irish media through Joe Duffy's Liveline. And to be honest, as if that wasn't already obvious by the fact that non-binary people, non-binary genders are still not legally recognised in this country and most countries around the world. As if that was not obvious by the fact that trans healthcare in this country is so abysmal. Let's not even stand around and pretend like it's anything substantial. And as if that wasn't obvious by the fact that intersex genital mutilation is still legal and practiced in this state. So these are all demands that our fantastic lineup of speakers are going to expand on and go into today, because it's crystal clear to us that we cannot trust this government, the Irish government, to provide us with the needs that we need. But we know that they absolutely can and they absolutely will, if they are forced to, if we mount the necessary pressure to demand free GP-led trans healthcare based on informed consent. The immediate banning of intersex genital mutilation. Relationships and sex education that is inclusive of LGBTQIA+ people, that is secular and mandatory in all schools regardless of faith. The separation of church and state. And the ending of the culture of homophobia and transphobia. So our first speaker, before we start marching, needs no introduction. Izzy Kamikaze, veteran LGBTQ+ activist and trans ally, and coiner of the term Live Lion.
That came as a little bit of a shock to me. Hang on a second. I have a half-written speech I'm going to try and read to you. I may well abandon it and go off-piste halfway through. It's something I often do. I'm afraid I'm a nightmare for sign language interpreters and editors generally. Okay, so good afternoon everybody and happy Pride. I know, yes, happy Pride. I know many of you are facing serious challenges at the moment. I really hope that the solidarity and friendship and love that we experience here today will help to sustain all of us through whatever lies ahead. I want to start by saying how pleased and proud I am to have been asked to speak here today. I was proud also to participate in the first Dublin Trans Pride in 2019, and the pride I feel in having been there, I want you to know, is just as important to me as my pride in having been part of the Fairview Park March 39 years ago. I hope we're going to do something huge next year, by the way, for the 40th anniversary. I really hope so. and indeed the first Dublin Pride March, which took place a few months later. Is this distorting very badly, or is it? No. Okay, it sounds rotten here, but maybe I should just step back a bit. So when we march today, we are making history, just as we made history back then. Every single time that we set aside the shame we were told to feel in ourselves and walk cheerfully and shamelessly through the streets, we are making history and changing the script that has harmed and sometimes even killed thousands just like us. We should never forget what our cheerful and determined presence on the streets of Dublin today means to all the people who are isolated and afraid and who have not yet found the courage to join us. Some of them will be watching us online on the GCN live stream. Others will peer through the windows of their workplaces or homes as we pass by. We march for ourselves today, but we march for those people too. If you are one of those people watching the live stream, you're probably in a lonely place right now. I hope you find a way to be with us in person next year. There's so many lovely new friends here waiting to meet you. Remember, we are marching today for you and looking forward to meeting you soon. There are other speakers here today who are far better qualified than I am to speak about the reasons why we need trans pride. So I'll stick to one area very close to my heart, and that is the urgent need to completely ban what is sometimes called conversion therapy, but should more accurately be called conversion practices, because there is absolutely nothing therapeutic about working to persuade trans people or gay people not to be gay or trans. I think it's very urgent that all LGBTQI people and our allies and our families and our friends should unite now to end these abhorrent practices which can affect all of us and can in fact also affect people who are cisgender and heterosexual but gender non-conforming, especially young people. Am I going too fast for you? No, you're fine. Okay. I think I'm just checking in because sometimes I run away. I think the general public misunderstands conversion practices, especially when the phrase conversion therapy is used. To be an arrangement with a therapist that is consensually entered into by an adult who is unhappy about their sexuality and or gender identity or gender expression and wants to change it. Now obviously this does happen occasionally, although it is clearly unethical for professionals to provide such a damaging and ineffective service. But the main market for conversion practices is usually the shocked and struggling parents of young gay or trans people who have recently disclosed that they are gay or trans, or who appear to their parents to be exploring their gender identity, gender expression, or sexuality. An entire industry has grown up around misinforming these confused and upset parents at a vulnerable time in their lives and telling them that their child has been misled by the internet or by their new LGBTQI friends into believing that they are gay, or these days especially trans or non-binary. And many are willing to pay for piss-poor parenting advice that encourages them to do everything in their power to isolate their children from their friends and do all they can to bully their children out of their entirely normal exploration of their own identity. Which of course includes exploration of exactly where they position themselves on the spectrum of gender identity and the somewhat related spectrum of sexual orientation. There are many supportive parents here with us today. We could give them a cheer, I think. And it's really great to have them with us. Now, 39 years ago when we marched to Fairview Park, there were some parents with us too, but they were only a handful. But the fact that they were there was so important to us, because for those of us whose parents had not reached that point yet, it showed us that it could happen. And of course, I think one of the things we need to remember, I'm talking quite a bit about parents, because I believe that parents who engage conversion advocates, let's say, for want of a better word, are being exploited. And I do not believe that most of those parents are evil people. I believe they are confused, upset people who are encountering a challenge in their lives that they're not prepared for. And I believe that they are being exploited. And for those of you who are having a lot of difficulty in your relationships with your parents, like right now, I would like to hold out the hope that for most of you, over the years to come, those things will be resolved. I certainly hope so. And I hope that every year that we're here, more and more of our parents are marching with us. The people who oppose comprehensive sex education, one of our demands today, in schools, always say that sex education is a job that should be left to the family. They seem to forget that the vast majority of child abuse and neglect happens in the family. That does not, of course, mean that most families are abusive. Most families are doing the best they can for their children. But for those children who are abused physically, sexually or emotionally, that abuse most often happens in the home and is perpetrated by the people who should be caring for them, and who quite often have been led to believe that this is the best way to care for them. Sometimes they have been advised to do so by people who should know better, teachers, religious leaders, sometimes even therapists. Quite often, they have been prevailed upon to pay for this bad advice. The parents themselves may not mean to be abusive. They're upset and confused. They're scared for their children. And always, 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 there are people who are willing to exploit those confused and upset parents and risk doing irreparable harm to their relationships with their children, sometimes for money, and sometimes because, just like the priests and nuns who advise families to pack away their pregnant daughters and dispose of their own grandchildren through untraceable and often illegal and fraudulent adoptions, the motive is not profit, but the maintenance of what they believe to be the natural order. Thank you. The family home is not always a safe place for children, and LGBTQIA kids have always been at increased risk of abuse in the home. When I came out 40 years ago, I heard many horror stories from friends who had been beaten by family members because of their sexuality. Others had not suffered physical violence, but had been bullied, humiliated and threatened by a parent or other relative who thought they brought shame on their family. One of the most frequent punishments was cutting a young person off from their friends. Others included confiscating or destroying any of the young person's clothing that was seen as too gay or in some way gender inappropriate, monitoring their phone calls or postal communications, because we didn't have the internet back in the Stone Age, sending them away to a new school, or sometimes simply throwing them out on the street. All of those things are happening today in Ireland to somebody, maybe a young trans person, maybe a young gay person from a particularly conservative or religious home, maybe somebody who is not even gay or trans or non-binary, but is supporting a friend who is, and this has aroused suspicions at home. We are marching for ourselves today, but we are marching for those people too. I'm sorry, I'm going on a long time. Do you have somebody who has a stick with a hook on the end of it to pull me off? 40 years of marching and organising and lobbying have broken down a lot of the stigma that once attached to homosexuality, and the public is a bit better informed about trans people too. But there is still a long, long way to go, and there are people who are working very determinedly to turn the clock back and reverse our gains. We have a fight on our hands right now, and we fight it for ourselves and for all those who should be here with us but are not yet safe to join us. I've been talking here about parents and their children, but many of these children are actually adults in their 20s and even 30s who are unable to move out of their parents' home and out from under their parents' rules because of the housing crisis. I grew up in a time when gay people were rarely mentioned and trans people never really, so people tended to come out a bit later than we do now. But I came out to a friend for the first time when I was 14. It's a little later than probably people would be doing so now. I came out in the sense that I started socialising in LGBT company when I was 19. So there's 5 years in between those two things. I believe that it was only possible for me to come out at 19 because I had been able to leave home at 17, you know, and practically no young person can do that now. So another thing that we need to always be aware of is that housing is a really important issue for young LGBT people coming out, and this is something that we must constantly address too. Housing is an LGBTQIA issue, and homelessness is an LGBT issue, and youth homelessness is especially an LGBT issue. Now, I've gone on a little bit too long, so I'm just going to round up. And I'm going to round up by saying that on the first day of June, I posted something on Twitter to say that my pledge for Pride Month, I should have said Pride Season because we go all summer these days, but my pledge for Pride Month was to write more about the activities of a lady called Stella O'Malley and her organisation GenSpect, and also to recruit people, LGBT people, into a campaign against conversion therapy, to completely ban the practice of conversion therapy. Now, when I say a campaign, the kind of campaign that I'm talking about is the kind of campaign that I was involved in the late 80s and early 90s with Dublin Act Up, when likewise we were in a bad place. HIV was being very neglected by the state and the LGBT community was picking up the slack. And, you know, nothing ever really changes. There's two things. I think sometimes people like to put a division between like radical queer activists and the more reformist, let's say, LGBT activists. But in reality, there is no division between us, because no change ever happens without having, on the one hand, the people who are going to sit down at the table and negotiate the change with the powers that be, and on the other hand, the people that are outside threatening to kick the fucking door down unless they get on with it. Okay? So I am hoping that we are going to get our act together around direct action once again, because I think it's time. And I think the whole focus of the anti-trans movement at the moment, it's not just anti-trans, it's anti-all of us. It's trying to drive wedges between us and divide us. And it's so good to see so many people here today in unity. And that unity is how we move forward. Now, somebody mentioned Live Line, or as I call it, Live Lion. Where, you know, a group of 8 women were refused access to a meeting that they had threatened to disrupt. And those 8 women were able to get coverage in every media outlet. Now, how many of us are there here today? Will we get the kind of coverage they got? I don't think they will. I don't think we will. I think we really have to look at what's happening in Britain with great concern, because what's happened in Britain, there's plenty of recent research that proves that the British public are not transphobic. This is not happening by public demand. This is happening because a small coterie of people, very much concentrated in the media and later in politics, have an agenda that they are trying to pursue, and that agenda involves dividing us from each other. Yeah, we absolutely must not let it happen. But I think what happened last month around Liveline and the fracturing of the relationship between RTE and Dublin Pride, and the way that that was reported, reflects very badly on our national media. And sadly, you know, I have been threatened in the last month with being sued for libel for something I haven't even written yet. GCN, our only community newspaper, has been threatened that if they publish me, there will be legal consequences that would bankrupt that community newspaper that this community has built up over the last 30 years, right? This is bullying. We need to call a spade, and we need to stand up against bullying. You know, I think I've rambled on for long enough. I want to say, you know, united we stand, divided we fall. As always. One final thing, and it relates to one of today's demands. I think, in my opinion, the most important demand, and something that feminists in Ireland have been demanding for the last 50 years, and that is the separation of church and state. Yes, I think we should do a lot of that chanting along the way, but maybe not just right now, because there are people dying of heat exhaustion. Anyway, I just want to say that anybody who is familiar with how education works in Ireland can have no doubt that the main forum for conversion practices in Ireland is going to be the schools, which are still very largely concentrated in the hands of the church. 50 years after feminists first started demanding that these be separated, the National Maternity Hospital has been handed over to the nuns in the last year, despite huge public opposition, and the church still controls our schools. And it is very alarming that there are organisations who are advocating conversion practices, advocating that students be misgendered, advocating that students be treated disrespectfully. I'm talking now about teenagers who are exploring their identity in a way that teenagers have always done, and that people are getting paid to go into our schools and advocate for these practices. And they're getting paid because the schools are conservative and by and large under the control of the church. I know, love, I'm sorry, okay? But I just want to say that I just want to mention Mick Barry, because Mick Barry stood up in the Dáil recently. I'm sure a lot of you were very pleased to see it, and he highlighted the fact that the Dublin Education and Training Board, no, not the Dublin Education and Training Board, the Education and Training Boards Ireland, which is what used to be called the VECs, had Stella O'Malley in to speak to them about how to manage gender issues in schools, right? Now, this is particularly concerning because the Irish education system is under pressure at the moment, I beg your pardon, to remove some of the schools from religious control in order to give more choice to parents. And they are doing that by handing over schools, including primary schools, to the Education and Training Boards. That's how it's being done. Now, the Education and Training Board schools are where the supportive parents, the parents who are supportive of young LGBT people and don't want them being abused in school, will send them. And this is an attempt to turn that entirely secular and state-funded mechanism against us, and it must not stand. Mick Barry did us all a great favour. I wish we had more public representatives who were prepared to stand up for us in that way. I understand that in the last couple of weeks, Stella O'Malley has made a complaint to the Procedures and Privileges Committee about being mentioned in the Dáil. She should be mentioned in the Dáil a lot more. She should be mentioned in the media a lot more. And we need to make it happen. Thank you, and happy Pride.
Thank you, Izzy.
Couldn't see the haunted forest for the trees regarding our gender identity and sexuality. When the snow like home. Empty air, an empty establishment. Friends with Dorothy, fighting for your civil rights. Out on the crew, streets too.